Let's start with a story that has upset a lot of people. The racism incident at a resort in the Free State has left many enraged. Videos on social media emerged of black teenage boys being assaulted by white adults. There have been varying versions of what may have happened here. But whatever the story, it's horrific and has once again raised the race debate in South Africa. Let's speak to Terry Oakley-Smith, a diversity expert. Dr. Seth Scooper joins us in studio, a Pan-African Psychology Union president, and Father Michael Lapsley, president of the Healing of Memories Global Network. Reconciliation, of course, it's a huge issue when you look at where we are finding ourselves as South Africa. Thank you so much to you all for your time. I'll begin with you, Father Michael. When you saw those videos emerge, what went through your mind?
Well, outrage. That all these years after we brought democracy and succeeded in a way in the fight against constitutionalized racism, that something so horrific should happen, and should happen to our children. So outrage in a sense that we needed to act as a nation decisively. The perpetrators should be brought to book and they should be punished accordingly. But I think it is, and I agree totally with our President Ramaphosa, who says that every single South African, black and white, needs to come out, and especially those of us who are white, and say, no, not in our name. This is completely unacceptable to us, and one feels for the pain of those teenage boys and also the pain of the parents. I was watching earlier tonight the interview with the father who said finally after COVID we could come and relax together as a family, and the kind of questions the children asking the father, is this the sort of thing you put up with? And the father struggling to answer.
And that is, one of the issues that I'd like us to talk about, because there has been now this debate that is, raging on social media about how our parents would have dealt with apartheid versus how this generation is now dealing with it. Terry, for you, as a white South African, when you saw what happened there, talk to us about what went through your mind.
I felt immensely ashamed to be a white South African. After all the years since 1994. And I also felt a sense of anger towards the ANC government, because there's been a Prevention of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, which has been around since 2016 and still has not been passed by Parliament or even sufficiently debated. And, unfortunately, this is only one of many hate crimes that occurred this year. I'm thinking, for example, not so long ago, we had the Stellenbosch University incident with a white student peeing on the belongings of a black student. So clearly this kind of racial crime is prevalent in our country, and it's really vital that we do something about it. And I just hope that the fact that the recently elected NEC is not diverse does not delay them in actually passing this bill. In so many ways, I can't help feeling that we're going backwards, Bongiwe.
Yeah, and Dr. Cooper, Professor Cooper, in fact, are we going backwards as a society, especially when you look at an elderly man who's supposed to be protecting a child, strangling a child? And really, in that moment, one wonders, are you not looking at this child as potentially your son?
No, I don't think he can. I think that the residual racism has reflected itself in this incident. I'm pleased that Father Michael and Terry have expressed themselves clearly on this, because in this situation, we require more whites to stand up and say that you cannot do this to another human being, that what we experienced in the past should stop. And I'm also pleased that reference has been made to the institutions. And I think that our Chapter 9 institutions have failed us hopelessly. Our police have failed us because, number one, this was an assault. From what I saw, and I stopped watching the video for my own protection, that this man was drowning this child.
Yeah.
Right. That is clear assault. The police should act. And I'm given to understand that the police actually did not want to accept a charge on this matter. There's the issue of clear, naked racism that's beginning to resurface in all sorts of places, in places where you'd least expect them. And especially what the father said, you know, he went there because of this festive period and wanted to relax. And the owner of that resort taking no responsibility for this incident, nobody interceding to say, stop it. If you did that to anybody, somebody ought to have interceded to stop it. But because it was somebody who was white, who assumed that they owned that place, assumed that there was no place for these kids to frolic in the water, all those factors come in. And we haven't dealt with racism in our country. 28 years after democracy, we have hopelessly failed our children. We have not protected them against this. Our schooling system does not prepare us for an anti-racist, anti-sexist education. What we've been fed is old colonial claptrap, and that cannot be allowed to continue in this country.
Is that then why you then see more and more younger people starting to then say, let's have the uncomfortable conversation, let's do what needs to be done? Because, you know, it almost seems as if they don't think there is any way where these conversations can be had.
Well, you know, you talked about right at the opening, how we confronted the past. Our children now are standing up. They need to be heard. And I think they need to lead the conversation. It cannot be us oldies, because we tend to make excuses for ourselves, for our incapacity, for our inability to deal with the social and economic issues that we confront in our society. So I think young people have taken to social media, which is good. I think that the conversations now need to be held with young people and other young people to share experiences, because these children ought not to have the shadows, the nightmares of our past continuing in the present, because they'll continue to impact the future. So it's a healthy sign that our children are doing this, because we did that. In the late 60s, 70s, into the 80s, we took up the cudgels. Now I think the kids doing it with our guidance, with our half-cent bit that we can provide to mediate these conversations so that they don't reach the kinds of eruptions that we saw in that pool. We don't get the kinds of attacks made by individuals. And importantly, women have to play a serious role in our society, because children are socialized largely by women. And it's interesting that the people who have come to notoriety in our country for racist incidents have been women. These women, the woman in the south coast of Sparrow, the woman who attacked the Metro policeman,
Vicky Bomber,
right? And this woman who blamed her
yes, of course, the outrage on
the diabetes,
and all
you
of
know,
that.
whereas she was in a conversation with somebody. That kind of hatred has to stop, because it festers, it carries over to young people. Our mothers teach our children how to behave. So I'm afraid for white children when their mothers tend to bring them up in this way.
Terry, are these conversations that Professor Cooper is talking about happening at the dinner table, or where are they happening?
You know, I would not like to be seen as a sort of the symbol of white motherhood in South Africa, and not really always party to the kind of conversations around the braai or the dinner table. I'm more likely to receive the hate mail after a conversation such as this. But I think that far more needs to be done in our schools, in fact, Bongiwe. I mean, we don't have a proper curriculum, an anti-racist curriculum. And schools would be an ideal place to start and to have these conversations. And I agree with what Sat says, that, you know, young people are the very people that we're going to have to depend on, because we have indeed failed so hopelessly. You know, we glided along on that myth of rainbowism, which never was and clearly is never going to be. We've never confronted our past. We've never worked through the kind of healing that needed to happen. And I don't know if it's too late now, so many years ago. But I think the other thing that's so important is that white people feel they can get away with racism. And that's also because there is no effective act in Parliament. There's no way that people can be taken to terms for this kind of racist behavior. And I really would urge our government to get on with debating and passing this hate crimes bill, because until there are adequate punishments for this kind of thing, I just feel that it's going to prevail, however many conversations we have. But I guess Father Michael is far more appropriate than me to talk about the healing issue.
Yeah.
But I think healing just hasn't happened, unfortunately.
And Father Michael, that's exactly the nub of it, because we talk about this healing process, and others would say that for healing to happen, you've got to start with the uncomfortable conversations. And then after unearthing that, you then move to the healing part of the conversation. Are we having those uncomfortable conversations enough?
Well, clearly not as much as we should be remotely. But one of the good things that came out of the horror that led to Black Lives Matter in the United States was beginning to be a conversation about white privilege. And I think we have to have that conversation, because that speaks to what Terry has said about those white men had the sense of entitlement purely on the basis that they were white. So I think often as white people who may be liberal or progressive, we say, oh, well, of course, we're against racism, or we're not racist, and we let ourselves off the hook. And also, in a way, these egregious acts also, in a strange kind of way, often let the rest of us off the hook from having the conversations about the subtle forms of racism that still pervade our society. So while we need decisive action, effective punishment of those responsible, there's a deeper conversation about how far we've got, and not just about anti-racism, but how do we unlearn racism? And we've rightly pointed to the schools, but we need to point to the political parties, who often are simply opportunistic on these issues, who jump up to when things are hot, but don't really help the nation have that conversation. But also, not surprisingly, I'd want to put out a shout out for the role, which is often not played by the faith community in unlearning racism as well. And I think it's important. I think Professor Sass also makes the same point in terms of women. There needs to be a much deeper conversation. So there's a relation between the patriarchy on the one hand, the racism on the other hand, the homophobia. It's all of a one in the sense of the denial of the fullness of our humanity. So unlearning racism is very important. And the curriculums, and I think the faith community, which is in some ways the most organized community in the nation, needs to play a leading role, as well as being repentant and self-examining of our own failures in this regard.
Father Michael, before I come back to Professor Cooper here in studio, is the church then, in its absence, suggesting that it's skirting around this issue, or simply not getting involved? What's going on there?
Well, I think in a way we are perhaps not surprisingly attracted to the language of reconciliation. You know, black and white together we shall overcome. We like the nice story, which is understandable. But then we don't do the hard work of saying this is not simply about race relations, it's about unlearning racism. And also it's about justice as well, and specifically racial justice. But of course, what feeds as well the anger of people is the failure for us to transform ourselves economically. So that feeds as well perfectly legitimate black anger as well as the unhealed wounds of the past. That I think in part of the reaction across the country is the unhealed wounds. Well, here we go again. How far are we? So it's a time for self-examination for every single South African.
Yeah.
What am I doing to help fight racism in my context? And do I speak against it in a way? You say, for example, at the closed dinner tables where there's only white people, what do we say there? And do we call out those who speak in a racist way or appear to give it permission to continue?
Prof, Father Michael mentioned something very critical, which is the other dynamic that's then brought in by political parties, because when we see these particular situations, you then see political parties that come in through various platforms. Let's talk about that added layer. Is it helping?
I don't think it's helping, because this is like going to funerals, make yourself heard. But they're not doing it in the places that they actually occupy. In the political spaces, they're not doing it. They're not holding accountable the Section 9 institutions that ought. The Human Rights Council Commission, for instance, issued a statement with this woman who ranted a few weeks ago. That's not good enough. And it's missing in action. We pay for them. They need to be held accountable. They're part of our government, if you like. And the political parties ought to call them to account. They ought to, in Parliament, get the bill passed. It cannot be that 6 years later this bill is not being passed. And it's interesting that the critical bills that impact our society take years to go through Parliament. The Children's Act, for instance, took many years, and this race bill is one that's taking many, many years. There are other critical acts like that just don't pass muster. So the parliamentarians are not doing their job. The political parties need to be hold the institutions accountable. They themselves are free to issue statements, but their actions should prove what they are about. Their actions should tell us that they are a harbinger for true change, that they look at all people as human beings, as part of the same human family, with the same biology, with some distinctions related to gender. But other than that, we all are constituted overwhelmingly of the same ingredients. All of us have hair, all of us have some amount of pigmentation, and so on. We are all human beings. And given that Father Lapsley is present, all are children of God, whichever God you pray to. I'd like to point out that organized religion has not come to the party as much, but the SACC did issue a statement. The problem is, there are more churches out there, individual prophetic churches and all sorts of groups out there who are not coming on board on this. Indeed, one of them had the temerity to visit Chris Hani's widow and point out the wrath of God to her as a political ploy. So I think we need to come to terms with the fact that we have not had any conversation at a public level. The TRC started it and it dropped. But at a public level, in all spheres, we need to confront our past. If we don't, those demons of the past will continue haunting our children. Our children, some of them may not experience what we experienced during apartheid, but they will bear the symptoms of that, and the future is going to be terribly troubled.
Sure, and that is really something that parents need to start thinking about. And Terry, when we look at, what becomes the response, every time there's an incident, it's either there's a statement, it's either there's a going there physically of, the scene of crime and what happened and all of that. Are we more reactionary than we are proactive as a country when it comes to dealing with issues of racism?
I think that it would be fallacious to say that it's not being dealt with. I mean, my own company, Diversity, has been working for 30 years, mainly in businesses, but also in universities and sometimes in schools, to address issues of anti-racism or unlearning racism, as Father Michael suggests, and also looking at other issues of prejudice, such as towards members of the LGBTIQ community, etc. So there are. It's not to say there's nothing happening, but it's becoming increasingly a difficult conversation to have when, at the end of the day, there's no justice. Because, I can carry on being racist if I'm racist, and I know that basically that there's no justice that's going to be meted out towards me. But I think the conversations are beginning, or have been going on for many years. I spoke about my own company, and there are other companies that are doing the same kind of work. But I also wanted to say that what Father Michael said about the churches, and not just the churches, but the mosques and also the temples, could be doing far more, I think. Preaching, they've got a captive community there on Fridays, if they're mosques, on Sundays, if they're churches, and it would be a very good place to start these conversations. So I think as a community, whether it be in our business, in our school, at our university, in our church, or wherever, and we as white people need to stand up and say, this is not me. You are not acting in my name. You are not a typical white South African. Me as a white South African, I don't feel this. I don't behave like this. And perhaps there's the need, Father Michael, for us as whites to be far more serious and thought-provoked about how we could actually galvanize the white population to stand up and say, not in my name.
Father Michael, I'll give you the final word then to respond to what Terry says very briefly.
I just wanted to make a particular emphasis on the reference to the crime of crimen injuria and how important that is, because it speaks to human dignity, the infinite worth of all people. And so that needs to be a punishable crime with very serious consequences, because that is perhaps the most terrible thing about apartheid, of what it did to people's sense of self-worth. So I just want to put a shout out for that, as well as for the hate crimes that Terry also, that be passed through Parliament. And we see this because I think in the wake of this terrible things that happened at the swimming pool, everybody's blaming everybody else. But I think we have to move forward to saying, what's the responsibility of every single South African to continue to fight racism? This is not what people for hundreds of years sacrificed for. They sacrificed for a non-racial, non-sexist South Africa, and we have to play our part in all the generations of ensuring that that happens, so that our children and grandchildren won't put up with what happened at that swimming pool again.
Thank you so much to you all for your time, and really important conversations must be had, especially when you look at issues around racism. So let me thank you all for your time. Father Michael Lapsley, President Healing of Memories Global Network, thank you for your time, as well as Terry Oakley-Smith, a diversity expert, and in studio with us, Professor Seth Scooper, Pan-African Psychology Union President.